Have you ever got that feeling where your brain just locks onto a puzzle it cannot solve, like a corrupted sector on a hard drive that keeps clicking? That's why I went to North Carolina. My name is Robert Gable. I spent 12 years as an IT specialist in Wichita. And when you spend your life debugging logical systems, you start craving something that doesn't make sense. My something was the beast of Bladenboro. I'm not a ghost hunter and I don't believe in aliens, but the reports from 1950s, the livestock drained of blood, the descriptions of a sleek, dark predator, they felt like a bug in the regional history that needed a manual override. I remember the drive into Bladenboro like it was this morning, though the memory feels heavier now. It was late April, that transition period where the southern humidity starts to thicken and the spring storms roll in like clockwork. I'd rented a small, isolated cabin about 15 miles outside the town limits, tucked deep into the pine barrens where the cell signal drops to a flat line. I had my gear in the back of the SUV, my laptop, a high-end thermal camera, and because I'm a creature of habit, my watchmaking kit. There's something about the micromechanics of a 1960s Omega, the tiny, predictable heartbeat of the gears, that keeps my hand steady when the world feels too big. Why does a predator only hunt in the dark? Why did the 1954 witnesses describe a sound like a crying woman coming from a cat-like throat? These were the questions looping in my mind as I pulled onto the gravel drive of the cabin. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and bloated with rain. I didn't have a dog, didn't have a partner, just the silence of the woods and the smell of ozone. I remember thinking it was peaceful. God, I was an idiot. By 8 p.m., the storm finally broke. It wasn't a normal rain, it was a deluge that turned the ground into a slurry of grey mud and pine needles. I was sitting at the small kitchen table, the light from my desk lamp flickering as the wind battered the siding. I had a 1974 Seiko Movement spread out on my velvet mat, tweezers in hand. I was trying to seat a hairspring, a piece of metal thinner than a human eyelash, when the first sound cut through the thunder. It wasn't a roar or a growl, it was a whistle, high, melodic, and completely out of place in a North Carolina swamp during a gale. It sounded like someone walking down a city street, casual and rhythmic. My hand slipped, the tweezers scoring a line across the brass plate of the watch. I froze. The whistling didn't stop, it just circled. It moved from the front of the cabin to the west side, then toward the back porch, moving faster than any person should be able to navigate that terrain in the dark. Then the whistling changed. It shifted into a voice. My voice. Not a recording, I know what a recording sounds like, but a perfect, vibration for vibration mimicry of how I sound inside my own head. Robert? The voice came from right outside the thin glass of the kitchen window. Robert, did you hear that? It was a question I'd asked myself out loud 10 minutes earlier when the thunder shook the house. But I was alone, and whatever was outside wasn't just repeating me, it was testing the weight of the words. I grabbed my flashlight and the heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. My heart wasn't just racing, it felt like it was trying to vibrate out of my ribs. I clicked the light on and swept it across the window. For a split second, the beam hit something. It wasn't a cat, it was pale, the color of a drowned limb, and it was crouched on all fours. But the joints were wrong, angled like a spider's legs pinned to a human torso. It had no hair, and its eyes didn't reflect the light like an animal's would. They just absorbed it. Two hollow pits of nothingness in a face that looked like it was made of wet clay. It didn't run, it simply stood up, its spine clicking like a series of breaking twigs, until it was nearly 7 feet tall. It looked at me through the glass, and its mouth, too wide, too many teeth, twisted into a shape that wasn't a smile but a mockery of one. Then it spoke again, using that same perfect Wichita accented voice of mine. "Robert, it's just a bug in the system. Let's fix it." Then the power went out, and the kitchen was plunged into a blackness so thick I could taste the copper in my mouth. When the power cut, the silence that followed was heavier than the darkness itself. In IT, we talk about dead air, that hollow space in a transmission where data should be, and that's exactly what the cabin felt like. I stood there, gripping the iron poker, my eyes straining to adjust, while my brain desperately tried to categorize what I'd just seen. The thing outside wasn't a beast of Bladenboro in the biological sense. It was something older, something that didn't follow the local firmware of nature. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with a cryptid from 1954 newspaper clipping, but something that had shifted its shape to fit the stories of whoever was looking for it. I felt a sudden, sharp vibration against my thigh. My phone. I pulled it out, the screen's harsh blue glow blinding me for a second. No signal, of course, but a notification was pulsing. Voice memo recorded, 8:14 p.m. I hadn't opened my recording app. My thumb hovered over the play button, shaking so hard I almost dropped the device. I pressed it. The audio was nothing but the sound of heavy rain for 5 seconds, and then a clear, crisp whisper. "Robert, the hairspring is out of alignment." It was my voice, but the tone was flat, devoid of the fear I was currently feeling. It was the voice of a man who wasn't human. Thump. Something heavy hit the roof, right above the kitchen. Then came the sound of dragging, something long and wet being pulled across the shingles. I didn't wait for it to find a way in. I bolted for the living room, grabbing my tactical bag and my Smith & Wesson 686, a 357 Magnum I'd brought just in case. I'm a marksman, not a fighter, but the weight of the steel in my hand felt like the only real thing left in a world that was turning into a fever dream. I needed to get to the SUV. If I could get to the vehicle, I could use the headlights and the engine to put some distance between me and that pale, clicking thing. I reached the front door, my hand on the deadbolt, when the scratching started on the other side of the wood. It wasn't claws, it sounded like fingernails, dozens of them, tapping a rhythmic chord against the oak. "Robert, help me, I'm stuck," a voice cried out from the porch. It wasn't my voice this time. It was a woman's voice, shrill, terrified, and familiar. It sounded exactly like Sarah, my sister back in Wichita. My logic center screamed at me that Sarah was 1,200 miles away, But the lizard brain, the part of us that hasn't evolved past the campfire, wanted to open that door. "You aren't her," I hissed, leaning my forehead against the door, the cold sweat dripping onto my glasses. "Sarah's in Kansas. You're just a parasite." The tapping stopped instantly. The silence lasted for 3 heartbeats before a low, guttural rasp vibrated through the door frame. "Kansas?" the voice repeated, distorted now, like a corrupted WAV file. "Kansas. Far away. Hard to download." The sheer wrongness of that sentence, the creature using my own professional terminology against me, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. I heard the thing drop from the roof then, a wet thud in the mud outside. I knew I had a window of maybe 5 seconds. I threw the bolt, kicked the door open and sprinted for the SUV. The rain was a wall of needles, blurring my vision, but the silver paint of the Jeep glinted under the flashes of lightning. I reached the driver's side door, fumbling with my keys. I felt a presence behind me, a sudden drop in temperature, the smell of old copper and wet fur. I didn't look back. I just swung the heavy bag behind me as a shield. Something slammed into the bag with the force of a wrecking ball, knocking me against the car. I rolled, catching a glimpse of a long, pale arm, far too long, with an extra joint near the wrist, withdrawing into the shadows of the pine trees. I scrambled into the driver's seat, slammed the door and locked it. My hands were slick with mud as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice, and then roared to life. I slammed the shifter into reverse and floored it, the tires screaming as they fought for traction in the slush. The headlights swept across the tree line as I spun the wheel. For a fraction of a second, the high beams illuminated the creature, standing in the middle of the driveway. It was wearing a face that wasn't quite mine, but a terrifying approximation of it, like a wax mask that had started to melt. It didn't move as I sped backward. It just raised a hand, a human-looking hand that was missing the pinky finger, and waved. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I thought I'd escaped the first encounter. I thought the beast was just a local legend I'd poked with a stick. I didn't realize that once you let something like that record your voice, it didn't just let you leave the session. I drove until the gaslights started blinking, ending up at an all-night diner near Elizabethtown, just far enough to feel like I'd crossed a border into reality. The fluorescent lights of the Dixie Grill hummed at a frequency that usually annoyed me, but that night it was the most comforting sound in the world. I sat in a corner booth, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that I couldn't stop from shaking. I needed a plan, a way to reconcile the data of what I'd seen with the laws of physics. That's when a man in a faded hunting jacket sat down in the booth across me without asking. He didn't look like a local legend expert. He looked like a retired mechanic, eyes tired and skin like cured leather. "You've got that look," he said, his voice a low rasp that sounded like gravel in a blender. The look of a man who's heard himself talk when he wasn't speaking. I didn't play dumb. There was no point. "It's a Skinwalker, isn't it?" I asked, the words feeling heavy and wrong in the air. He shook his head slowly. "Names don't matter much to things that change theirs every hour. But out here, we call it the Mimic of the Pines. He leaned in, his voice dropping. It doesn't just want your blood, son. It wants your sequence. It collects pieces of us, voices, faces, movements, until it can walk into a house and sit at a dinner table without the wife even noticing the shadow is the wrong shape. He told me his name was Elias, and he'd lost a brother to it back in '98. He wasn't armed with silver bullets or magic. He had a heavy-duty maglite and a sawed-off shotgun loaded with rock salt and buckshot. It's a hunter of opportunity, Elias explained, but once it targets a frequency, it follows the signal. I realized then that my SUV with its GPS and integrated Bluetooth was basically a beacon. We decided to head back toward the cabin together, not because I was brave, but because Elias convinced me that if I fled now, it would just follow me back to Wichita, using my sister's voice to get through the front door. We had to break the loop here. The drive back was a descent into a different kind of storm. The rain had stopped, but a thick unnatural fog had settled over the Bladenboro roads, so dense the highlights barely penetrated 10 feet. We reached a narrow bridge over a Blackwater Creek, about 5 miles from the cabin, when the SUV's electronics began to haywire. The radio started scanning through stations, static screaming, before settling on a rhythmic clicking sound. "That's the sound of it thinking," Elias whispered, gripping his shotgun. Suddenly the SUV's engine just died. Total system failure. As an IT guy, I knew a dead battery or a fried alternator, but this felt like the car had been remotely wiped. Before I could even try the ignition, the passenger side window shattered. Not inward, but outward, as if something had vacuumed the glass away. A pale, elongated hand, the one with the missing pinky, reached in and grabbed Elias by the throat with a speed that defied biology. He didn't even have time to scream. He was pulled through the small window frame like he was made of liquid, his bones snapping with a sound like dry firewood. "Elias!" I screamed, lunging for the passenger side, but there was nothing left but a smear of blood on the upholstery and his dropped flashlight. I scrambled out the driver's side, my 357 drone, the world spinning in the fog. I could hear him, Elias, calling from the woods. "Robert, help me! It's got my leg, over here!" It sounded exactly like him, the same gravely rasp, but the voice was coming from 3 different directions at once. It was a predatory surround system, designed to disorient the prey. I ran toward the most consistent sound, the flashlight beam cutting pathetic holes in the mist. I found Elias, or what I thought was him, slumped against a cypress tree. But as I got closer, the flashlight revealed the truth. It was Elias's jacket, stuffed with wet pine needles and mud, arranged to look like a body. Above me, the branches creaked. I looked up just in time to see the creature, now sporting Elias's face on a neck that was 3 feet long, drop from the canopy. It didn't hit me. It landed with a soft, sickening squelch and wrapped its limbs around me. Its skin felt like cold, wet parchment. As the world went dark, the last thing I heard was my own voice, laughing in my ear, saying, "System update complete." Awareness didn't return all at once. It flickered like a monitor with a loose connection. I was upright, my back against the rough bark of an ancient, gnarled oak, but my wrists and ankles were bound with something that felt like cold, braided sinew. The smell was the worst part, a cloying mix of stagnant swamp water and the metallic tank of a butcher shop. I was in a clearing I didn't recognize, deep within the barrens where the trees grew so thick they seemed to weave together like a cage. In front of me, Elias's body lay, unceremoniously in the dirt, but it looked hollowed out, like a discarded shell. The creature was there, crouched over my tactical bag, which I dropped during the struggle. It was meticulously picking through my watchmaking tools with those impossible, elongated fingers. It held up a tiny brass gear, the light of the moon, now visible through a break in the storm clouds, glinting off the metal. Its face was a shifting slurry of features. One second it looked like the man from the diner, the next it smoothed out into a blank, featureless oval. It was trying to find a form that clicked, much like I tried to seat a balance wheel into a movement. "Why?" I managed to croak, my throat feeling like it was lined with glass. The thing froze. It turned its head, a full 180 degrees, and looked at me with eyes that were now a perfect, terrifying replica of my own. "Redundancy," it said, the voice a perfect blend of mine and Elias's. "The original, Robert, is corrupted by fear. Fear is noise. I am the signal." It stood up, its joints popping like a hailstorm on a tin roof, and began to walk toward me with a gait that was a rhythmic, mechanical mockery of my own stride. It reached into the bag and pulled out my watchmaking lamp, the magnifying eyepiece I used for the delicate work. It pressed the lamp against its own pale, lidless eye, squinting just as I did when I looked for a microscopic burr on a pallet fork. It was learning my soul through my habits, but as an IT specialist, I knew one thing about any system. The more complex it is, the easier it is to crash. I looked down at my hands. The creature hadn't noticed that my fingers were resting near the side pocket of my cargo pants, where I kept a small pressurized canister of electronic contact cleaner, 90% isopropyl alcohol. "You want my sequence?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "You missed the most important part." The creature paused, leaning its face inches from mine, its breath smelling of ancient rot. "What part?" It mimicked the curiosity of a predator sensing a new scent. "The failsafe," I said. With a surge of adrenaline, I jerked my right hand, the sinew binding slicing into my skin, and grabbed the canister. I didn't spray its eyes. I sprayed a velvet mat of watch parts and the open bottle of lubrication oil sitting in the bag right beneath its chest. In my left hand, I had my Winpro Zippo, the one I used to heat the shellac for the watch jewels. I flicked the lighter. The spark caught the alcohol mist, and a pillar of blue and orange flame roared upward, engulfing the creature's torso and the dry pine needles at its feet. It didn't scream like a human. It emitted a high-frequency screech that sounded like a hard drive grinding itself to dust. The creature recoiled, the heat melting its mimicked skin, revealing the gray, corded muscle beneath. The sinew holding my wrists slackened as the creature lost its focus, and I tore myself free, the skin on my arms peeling away with the bindings. I didn't run immediately. I grabbed Elias's shotgun from the dirt where it had fallen and leveled it at the center of the burning mass. "Hard reset, you son of a bitch," I growled. I emptied both barrels. The rock-salt, and buckshot tore through the creature, sending it tumbling back into the thicket of burning brush. It thrashed, its form flickering rapidly between Sarah, Elias, me, and things I couldn't even name. A frantic, dying slideshow of stolen identities. I turned and ran, the light of the growing forest fire illuminating a path through the fog. I found the main road by dawn, flagged down a passing state trooper, and told him a story about a gas leak and the forest fire. They never found a body, not Elias's, not the creature's. They just found a charred patch of woods and a melted pile of watch parts. I'm back in Wichita now, sitting in my workshop, but I don't fix watches anymore. My hands shake too much for the hairsprings. And every time I record a voice memo for a client, I play it back 3 or 4 times, listening for the static. Because sometimes, in the dead air between my words, I hear a faint, melodic whistle, and a voice that sounds exactly like mine, asking if I'm ready for the next update.